Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to my channel where I reveal the spiritual in everything. Subscribe because I upload a new video every single weekday and I've no idea why I've started laughing whenever I get to that point. I host a public live stream every single Saturday and then I host another live stream on the Sunday for my Patreon supporters. You can help me spread the very beneficial message of experiential spirituality by supporting me on Patreon for £5 or more a month, for which you will gain access to my Patreon blog and for which you will receive a copy of my book Experiential Spirituality, The Mystic Answer to Everything, in PDF format. Thank you very much to those of you that support me on Patreon thus far, because you really do make this kind of daily content possible. And if you check the pinned post on my Patreon blog where you downloaded your copy of this book from, you'll see that you can now download my rendition of the Gospel of Thomas as well, because I made that available last night. And what I'm going to do on the Patreon blog in the near future is a commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. I'm going to go through the entire Gospel, one saying at a time. However, I am going to do that commentary in written form. Firstly, because I don't think I can possibly appear on camera any more than I already do. And secondly, because I've always preferred to do commentaries of sacred texts in written form. And that's especially true of mystic texts like the Gospel of Thomas, because when you're writing something, you can sit there and take your time to contemplate and reflect, which is more appropriate for mystic texts. Whereas if you're in front of a camera, you're always under pressure to keep talking. So I'm going to begin doing that commentary on the Gospel of Thomas on my Patreon blog in the very near future. Now, last week I talked about how there is nothing wrong at all with the mere presence of negative phenomenon within you. That negative phenomenon specifically being negative mental phenomenon in the form of thoughts, or negative ethereal phenomenon in the form of negative emotions. I talked about how such negative phenomenon is merely a natural response of your mind and your ethereal form to certain external factors, and that the mere presence of such phenomenon says nothing at all about your spiritual status. Yet the question remains, how does one prevent such phenomenon from overwhelming one? And the most obvious answer to give is meditation. And I will certainly talk about meditation in the near future. However, I regard that as something of a long-term solution. In this video, I just want to make a few points that will prove very helpful should you understand what I'm saying. And to help illustrate those points, I'm going to use a very specific example of negative phenomenon, specifically negative mental phenomenon. And that example is insecurities, because insecurities are fundamentally thoughts. They are thoughts about oneself, or at least the way one understands oneself. And that negative thought, if indeed it is negative, can generate other negative thoughts, and it can, of course, generate all manner of negative emotions as well. The first thing to say is that I doubt there is a soul in this world that wouldn't change something about their mind or something about their physical form if they had the choice, and that is certainly true of me as well. I would wish that my nose was a little bit smaller, for example. I would also wish that it wasn't broken. I would wish that I wasn't quite so thin. I would wish that my arm hadn't been broken out of shape permanently. I would wish that my left hand hadn't been slashed and that I therefore hadn't lost most of the articulation in it. There are all manner of things that we would wish were different about ourselves, especially our physical forms. But those things only really become insecurities when they trouble you. These things about myself that I would wish were different, they don't trouble me, and therefore I can happily talk about them openly. And they're not necessarily false either. If you're to compare my physical form to the objective standard of male beauty, as it were, you would see that I'm quite right in my assessment. It is quite an objective assessment. But how does one deal with such issues if they do become insecurities? How does one deal with such issues if they do trouble you on an emotional level? Well, one very common approach to this is in the form of positive affirmations. So one might continuously say to oneself, you are perfect as you are beautiful, and so on and so forth. There are many problems with positive affirmations, and there's a reason that they don't typically work for very long, if they work at all. The first reason is that if someone really is dissatisfied with their appearance in some way, then they will innately feel that repeating positive affirmations to the contrary are really just a way of convincing themselves of something that fundamentally isn't true. And it may be the case that that observation about your physical form that is troubling you actually is a legitimate observation, as is the case with my observations about myself. Perhaps you feel that you are overweight, for example, and that troubles you, and yet the fact is that, objectively speaking, in comparison to the average person, maybe you are overweight, and therefore all the positive affirmations in the world aren't going to make a difference to the way that you feel about yourself. But there's a more fundamental problem with using positive affirmations to combat these kind of insecurities, and that problem is that positive affirmations, or any form of affirmations, they are themselves thoughts. And the source of this problem, as I mentioned earlier, is thought. So what you're fundamentally doing when you use positive affirmations to combat insecurities is that you're fighting one thought with another thought. And this is not so much a case of fighting fire with fire, so much as it's a case of fighting fire with gasoline. Because the problem with combating thoughts of any kind is that, far from you defeating those thoughts, in most cases you're actually only going to generate more resistance. You're going to build those thoughts up, and they are in turn going to generate even more negative thoughts than they otherwise would have. The key here is to recognize insecurities as thoughts and to understand the true place of thought as far as your experience of reality is concerned. Because when you consider the matter, you have all manner of thoughts and all manner of emotions that do not trouble you. So why does this particular thought, or why do these particular thoughts concerning your physical appearance or the way your mind works, why do they trouble you so much? Is it because they are somehow more muscular than other thoughts? No, they are just thoughts. Thoughts are just thoughts, in the same way that emotions are just emotions. However, you feel otherwise. You feel that these thoughts and these emotions are more powerful simply because they concern your egoic identity, which is the way you understand yourself, and therefore it feels so much more personal to you. And yet, your egoic identity, the way you understand yourself, it's really just a structure of thoughts. It too is an intellectual construct that exists within the mind. So the key to overcoming insecurities is not by fighting them with a more positive thought, because that will just generate more resistance and make the situation worse. The key is in recognizing that it is indeed a thought, and that in reality, this thought about yourself, that which becomes an insecurity, it's really no more powerful than any other thought, the kind of thought that you just dismiss immediately because it doesn't seem to have that kind of grip on you. So recognize that thoughts are just thoughts, and no matter how personal it may seem to be to you, it's ultimately just a thought. You are not your thoughts. You yourself are not a thought. You are not an intellectual construct like your egoic identity, nor are you an emotion. You are the consciousness that observes both thought and emotion. So the next time that a thought arises, the next time that an insecurity arises, just say to yourself, it's just a thought, and begin to observe it as such. Say to yourself consciously, this is just one more thought that is the same as every other thought that I've dismissed and not cared about today, and I'm going to regard it as such. Now right there, what you're doing is you're using a thought to combat another thought, but the thing is that this thought, this recognition, it pushes you beyond thought, because then you take the place of the observer that you actually are, and then you can experientially look at these thoughts as just being thoughts. And so there, you've gone from someone who was trying to combat a negative thought with an ostensibly positive thought to someone who has taken your true position as consciousness, your true position as the observer that observes all thoughts and that observes all emotions and is therefore transcendent to them. It's about, again, experientially recognizing that you as spirit, as consciousness, naturally transcend all thoughts, all emotions, and all other forms of negative phenomenon, and therefore you experientially recognize, instead of merely intellectually believing, that they can only have power over you if you allow them to have power over you. Now, I have much more to say on this matter concerning the egoic identity and the place of meditation in helping you to transcend that lower phenomenon, but that's all I've got time for in this video. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and I will see you tomorrow.